should hopefully remember the basic definitions of the levels of organization. The rest of this course is going to focus on these upper levels, species through biosphere. A species is the individual living organism. A population is all the individuals of a given species in a specific area at a certain time. Communities are all the different populations in a specific area or region at a certain time. Ecosystem is one or more communities in an area and the abiotic factors involved, whereas the biome is the individual ecosystems grouped together according to climate, vegetation, and characterized by the adaptations of organisms in that biome. And the biosphere is, of course, everywhere that life occurs on Earth. Each level is defined by a certain type or number of organisms or a combination of biotic and abiotic. You do need to be aware of all these definitions. Within an ecosystem, organisms have specific places where their needs are met and their specific roles within the ecosystem. The place where an organism lives in order to obtain its food, water, what have you, is its habitat. The niche is its particular role in the environment. For example, the niche of a bee is to pollinate flowers as it gathers nectar for its food. Habitat is kind of like your address, where your niche is like your job. There are various factors that can change the environment. These factors include natural hazards. Natural hazards can be defined as any naturally occurring event that has an effect on the ecosystem: floods, hurricanes, wildfires, and they're going to cause some significant change. Climate is a long-term thing. Climate refers to the temperature and the amount of rainfall in a particular environment. Changes in temperature and rainfall from what's normal will have an effect on the populations. Limiting factors we're going to look at more in just a moment. But all these things are going to affect species, they're all going to affect each other, and they can have drastic effects on how many species occur in an area, what type of species occur in an area, how a species is going to survive. A limiting factor is any factor that slows population growth. It's regulated by limiting factors that are density dependent, density independent, abiotic, or biotic. Abiotic is non-living. Biotic is living. So climate, rocks, soil, pH, that's going to be abiotic, where predators, parasites, competitors, those are going to be biotic. Density dependent factors operate more strongly as population density increases. Basically, it's triggered by an increase in population density, crowding, competition, predation, parasitism, disease. Whereas density independent is going to occur regardless of how many organisms there, how crowded it is, fire or a flood, pollution, weather. These things occur, and crowding doesn't really make these things occur. So therefore it's density independent. So if you were to be dealing with the spread of a bacterial disease, that is going to be density dependent and it's going to be biotic. We know that a population is a group of organisms belonging to the same species that live in a particular area. Populations can be described based off of their size, how many there are, their density, how many there are per area, their range, how far spread out they are. All of these things underlie what a population is and determine a lot of factors about how a population is going to survive. Range is, of course, controlled by geographical limiters. Biotic factors, abiotic factors, say the polar bear, their range is drastically shrinking as climate changes. Habitat is going to be part of range. If you don't have the habitat you like to live in, you're not going to survive well. Ranges are going to change with the environment, with competition, invasive species. All these things can affect range. As we are dealing with a warmer and warmer climate, species are spreading from the equators up, and the ones that like the cold, they're slowly dying out. Within a population's geographic range, local densities may vary substantially. Variations in local density are among the most important characteristics that a population ecologist might study, since they provide insights into the environmental associations and social interactions of the species. There are three major patterns. You have the clumped, you have the random, and you have the uniform. Clump dispersion is the tendency of populations to be found in tight clusters. Humans, for example, cluster around water sources. Random, basically there is no difference in situations. Their ability to live anywhere in a given habitat, say dandelions, when they spread, it's kind of random where they land, and they can grow up just fine. Uniform, that tends to be some sort of indicator of territoriality, generally caused by a species' ability to survive anywhere in the habitat. They use the resources found immediately around them and spread out as to use all of the available resources. So the way that a population lives in their spacing can show us a lot about their interactions and how they survive. Population density is calculated by dividing the number of individuals in a population by the unit area, where if you look at the size of the population, it's going to be affected by the number of births, the number of deaths, the numbers of individuals entering the population or immigrating, and the number of individuals leaving the population or emigrating. So if you look at population size, you're going to have to factor these in. Births and immigration cause a population to go up. Deaths and emigration cause a population to go down. When you actually look at population growth, there are two major models. The exponential growth model describes a population that grows at a constantly increasing rate. It's a characteristic J shape. Real populations, exponential growth only occurs for a limited period of times when the conditions are optimal, when resources are unlimited, say you're going into a new population or you're being reestablished in a previously filled area that the species has died out. More common is the logistic model, or that S curve, where it levels off when it reaches what's called carrying capacity, which is the maximum number of individuals that an environment can support over long periods of time without harming the environment. Now, carrying capacity can change if the environment is harmed or if the environment changes in some way, but in a logistic growth situation, the populations become stable around carrying capacity. Keystone species have major effects on community structure and biological situations. There's bottom-up nutrient controls and top-down predator controls, but keystone species have an unequal effect on their environment. In this example with Pisaster, which is the sea stars you see in the top right, if Pisaster is there, you end up with a very high number of species on average. That line stays relatively constant and even increases over time. But if you remove Pisaster, what happens? Well, the mussels outcompete, and you end up with a bunch of mussels and not much else, and the biodiversity is extremely poor. So keystone species have an unequal effect, and the easiest way to find out if a species is keystone is to remove it from a sample area and see what happens. Top predators tend to be keystones because they control that top-down effect. Looking at the actual survival of a species, we see that there are overall three major structures. These are obviously averaged out and simplified. Some species use parts of one and parts of another, but a type 1 curve is flat at the start, reflecting low death rates during an early and middle life, and then it drops steeply as you get older. Humans and many other large mammals follow this. Type 3 curve drops sharply at the start, reflecting a very high death rate for the young, but then flattens out as death rates decline for those few individuals that have survived to a certain critical age. Say an oyster may release millions of eggs, but most offspring die as larvae from predation or other causes. Those few that survive long enough to get that hard shell will probably survive for a long period of time. A type 2 curve overall is going to be more intermediate, and you'll see that as that slope. It's going to be that constant mortality. There's no difference between young and old. Natural selection favors a life history that maximizes reproductive success. The more kids you have, the more evolutionarily fit you are, the more effect you have on your environment. There are two major reproductive strategies. These occur on a continuum K to R. So species can be a little bit K, a little bit R, what have you. K-selected species, they favor just a few offspring. They reproduce late, but they invest a lot of energy in maintaining those offspring, and they tend to survive. R-selected ones put a lot of energy into making a lot of offspring, but they don't really put a lot of energy into making sure that the offspring survive. So bears, K-selected. Sunflowers, R-selected. Insects mostly are R-selected. If you think about something like the coconut, though, they don't really produce a lot of offspring. They put a lot of energy into it, so they're K-selected. So don't just think just because it's a plant that it has to be R. You need to look at the type of offspring, the amount of offspring, and the amount of energy it costs to produce and to encourage survival of those offspring.